Welcome back to another episode of STEM Teacher Lounge. I'm your host, Patrick Spedding. In today's episode, we'll be exploring cognitive load theory and its potential integration with Peter Liljedahl's thinking classrooms. Joining me today are two experts in secondary STEM education, Alex Simpson and Jesse Sully. Alex, let's start with you. Could you tell us a little about cognitive load theory? Who are the key researchers behind it? And what are its basic components?
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be here today to discuss this important topic. Cognitive load theory was formulated by John Sweller in the 1980s. It aims to optimize the limited capacity of our working memory, which is particularly relevant in secondary education, where students encounter a range of subjects with varying complexities for the first time. Cognitive load theory, or CLT, assumes a limited working memory that stores about 7 elements but operates on just 2 to 4 elements. According to Merenbauer and Sweller, it is able to deal with information for no more than a few seconds, with almost all information lost after about 20 seconds unless it is refreshed by rehearsal. The theory categorizes cognitive load into 3 components: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane, where intrinsic load is considered fixed by virtue of the subject matter being taught. Extraneous load is the noise that distracts from the learning process. Germane load is best looked at as the way we file things for easy retrieval. This categorization allows for more effective instructional design. However, I think it's important to consider the context of the teaching and how CLT interacts with other learning outcomes. While managing cognitive load is important, it doesn't define all the challenges in the classroom.
That's very interesting. Jesse, let me turn to you. Can you elaborate on how cognitive load theory relates to working memory and why this might be important to understand?
Cognitive load theory is about freeing up one's working memory. In the words of Merenbauer and Sweller, expertise develops as learners mindfully combine simple ideas into more complex ones. An example is a chess expert who combines simple ideas about the best positioning of individual pieces to develop complex schemata of how several chess pieces should be positioned concomitantly. These schemata organize and store knowledge, but also heavily reduce working memory load because even a highly complex schema can be dealt with as one element in working memory.
Thanks, Jesse. That's a great summary. Now, can you describe how you would apply cognitive load theory in a typical classroom setting to improve learning outcomes?
Well, in a typical classroom, CLT aims to maximize transfer to long-term memory in 2 ways. Firstly, reducing intrinsic cognitive load by simplifying the information for students, and secondly, reducing extraneous cognitive load by reducing distractions. Overall, there are 7 strategies that could be applied in the classroom. One strategy that works well in a maths classroom is strategy number 2, the use of worked examples. A worked example is a problem that has already been solved for the learner, with every step fully explained and clearly shown. The worked example effect is the widely replicated finding that novice learners who are given worked examples to study perform better on subsequent tests than learners who are required to solve the equivalent problems themselves. This is supported by research carried out by Carroll, Cooper and Sweller. The reason for this, according to cognitive load theory, is that unguided problem-solving places a heavy burden on working memory, inhibiting the ability of the learner to transfer the information into their long-term memory. The learner may effectively solve the problem, but because their working memory was overloaded, they may not recognize and remember the rule that would allow them to quickly solve the same problem again in the future.
Let me bring Patrick in on this. Patrick, how do you see thinking classrooms complementing or contrasting with cognitive load theory?
Well, both theories aim to improve learning, but approach it differently. Thinking classrooms focus on engagement and active learning, engaging students through strategies like thinking questions, visibly random groups, and vertical non-permanent surfaces. It aims to create an environment where students are actively involved in the learning process. These strategies can be integrated with CLT's focus on optimizing cognitive load for a more holistic educational experience. Liljedahl argues that institutional norms around classroom layout and pedagogy have changed little over centuries. Breaking norms increases the amount of thinking that students are doing. Liljedahl states, if students are not thinking, they are not learning, suggesting that traditional direct instruction encourages mimicking, which is not learning behavior. In Liljedahl's research, prior to implementing the thinking classroom strategies, In a typical secondary mathematics class, 20% of students spent 20% of their time thinking. The remaining 80% did no thinking at all. After implementation, this changed to 80% of students spending 80% of their time thinking. Coming back to you, Alex, to what extent do you think critical load theory is universally applicable, considering individual differences among students?
Well, I think that's one of the particular issues with CLT, that it isn't applicable to every situation. Students with sensory disabilities are particularly at risk of disadvantage. One of the strategies, utilizing the multimodal effect, recommends simplifying complex information by presenting separate components visually and through speech. A student with autism or a hearing disability who has trouble processing the spoken word will only get half the picture, as will a student who has a visual impairment. Students who have similar subclinical unknown issues in sight or hearing will also be disadvantaged without the teacher being aware. Regarding other strategies, a student who has trouble with imagination, such as someone with aphantasia, may not benefit at all from strategy 7, visualization. They may not even know that they have this issue. Having said that, application of CLT to conveying information in specific ways, mindful of both context and student differences, is a strategy I think has merit.
I would like to add CLT's focus on the limitations of working memory has been criticized for being overly reductionist. Learning is a complex process influenced by various factors such as motivation, prior knowledge, and social context, which are not fully accounted for in CLT.
Interesting. What would you say are some of the limitations or criticisms that have been raised against cognitive load theory?
The main criticism I find concerning CLT is that it doesn't effectively explore critical thinking as a teachable skill. Indeed, in a recent interview concerning his 20-year review of CLT, John Sweller makes the shocking claim that critical thinking is biologically primary and so unteachable. His foundation for this seems to rely heavily on the work of controversial evolutionary psychologist Dr. David C. Geary. These views are strongly refuted by Ellerton, who says the concept that critical thinking is unteachable, quote, stands in contrast to a significant body of research and pedagogical practice that does not seem to be engaged with or addressed by CLT, end quote. In short, I believe that Sweller has stepped out of his lane, with some strong claims that the research community doesn't fully support.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that assessment. Merriam-Boer and Ayres also showed that sequencing learning tasks from simple to complex is not desirable and may even be detrimental in the case of students with higher prior knowledge of the task. In other words, differentiation will be critical in using CLT effectively. And Bateman and colleagues found exceptions in which the simple heuristic of reducing potentially distracting or irrelevant information did not lead to better learning performance, but rather had the opposite effect. Interestingly, Skomolsky and Manzhu demonstrated that many of these exceptions arose in the context of online learning. Finally, how might a student in secondary education perform differently if their school were to implement a hybrid model combining cognitive load theory and thinking classrooms?
A student in this kind of hybrid model could experience a more engaging, effective, and enriching learning environment. The combination of CLT's empirically driven strategies and the active, collaborative learning promoted by thinking classrooms could offer a balanced and holistic educational experience. For example, thinking classrooms encourage active student participation through problem-solving and inquiry-based learning. When coupled with CLT's focus on optimizing cognitive load, students are likely to engage more deeply with the material. The use of thinking questions from Liljedahl's model, designed within the CLT framework to manage cognitive load, could also lead to enhanced critical thinking skills. I like to think of CLT as only one of a set of tools in a teacher's tool belt. Just as a builder can have just one tool for every need, but has many in his tool belt to draw upon, teachers need to acquire a smattering of all tools which will complete the teacher and provide means for every situation.
As we wrap up, could you both summarize the benefits and potential drawbacks of integrating cognitive load theory with thinking classrooms in secondary education?
CLT can optimize learning and improve engagement. However, challenges remain in its practical implementation, and it's important that CLT can coexist with other pedagogies.
And to add, While the integration promises a more holistic educational experience, the complexity of tailoring instruction to individual cognitive loads can be a significant challenge.
Thank you, Alex and Jesse, for this enlightening and evidence-based discussion. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today on STEM Teacher Lounge.